Hi, everyone. Welcome to our fourth and final day of our CSAC Honors Program final presentations. I am Cameron Tracy. I'm the co-instructor for the Honors Program alongside Harold Trinkunis there in the back. But you're here today to see one or two of our two students who will be presenting, Sean Lee and then Maryam Khalil. Each is going to present for about 20 minutes on their honors thesis research, after which we'll have about 10 minutes of Q&A to discuss their work with them. If you're in the room, you simply need to raise your hand. I'll moderate during that. If you're viewing online, then the Q&A function on Zoom will be useful. You can enter any questions you have there, and I will relate them to our speakers during that Q&A portion. So without further ado, let's start with our first speaker, Sean Lee.
All right, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Sean Lee, and today I'm presenting my thesis, Not Just Pawns on a Chessboard, Exploring Challenges and Nuances to Traditional Explanations of Southeast Asian Countries Hedging Between the US and China. And I want to give first a special shout out to my advisors, Professor Vardy over there and Professor Cohen. So, I guess the first question is, why talk about Southeast Asia? Well, I guess the real question is, why not? And I think that's the question that I have for many people in Washington, D.C., which is that Southeast Asia is an often under-researched area, despite its global significance. There are 11 countries in Southeast Asia, 10 of which are in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and this region is a rapidly growing region of 700 million people, forming the world's 7th largest economy, and of increasing geostrategic importance to everyone around the world. Here you see the global shipping lanes that have to traverse through the Strait of Malacca, Singapore, the South China Sea, all of this being in Southeast Asia, which accounts for a third of world maritime traffic. 60% of all world crude oil also passes through Southeast Asia, including over 80% of China's crude oil. And virtually all international trade must pass through this region when connecting between Asia, Europe, and the Americas. In addition, another way that Southeast Asia is becoming of increasing importance is through the semiconductor supply chain. There's been a lot of talk about how semiconductors are, becoming of increasing significance to the US and the PRC, the People's Republic of China, due to great power conflict. But Southeast Asia is often underlooked area of importance in the supply chain, considering that the wafers of semiconductors have to be assembled and shipped from Malaysia and Singapore and other Southeast Asian countries. The importance of Southeast Asia has not gone unnoticed to both the PRC and the United States. As you can see here, multiple Southeast Asian countries, along with the PRC, have overlapping territorial claims in the South China Sea, the same channel through which a third of worldwide maritime traffic flows and 60% of worldwide oil. As you can see, these disputes have not been resolved peacefully, as evidenced by the construction of artificial military islands in the South China Sea. And the United States also has a vested interest in protecting its interests in Southeast Asia, as evidenced through frequent freedom of navigation missions run by the US Navy. With the growing importance of Southeast Asia to global geopolitics, Southeast Asian countries' so-called actions have often been interpreted by observers as hedging towards closer to the United States or closer to the PRC. For example, when the Philippines signs a military agreement with the United States, it's perceived as moving closer to the US. Meanwhile, when, for example, Malaysia or Cambodia signs economic agreements with the PRC, they're sort of categorized as hedging towards the PRC. And this is the common interpretation amongst many policy observers, Washington, D.C., Beijing, in interpreting Southeast Asian countries' behavior in terms of whether they are signaling their alignment towards the United States or the PRC. These are pictures that I actually took on my most recent trip to Malaysia. So the reason why that I'm interested in this topic is because my family is from Southeast Asia. And I've often heard this characterization of Southeast Asia and Southeast Asian countries as constantly having to pick sides and choose between the United States and the PRC. That constantly, whenever Malaysia decides to sign an agreement with the United States, or when Indonesia decides to sign an agreement with China, that sort of signals that they are reacting towards the US or towards the PRC. As you can see here in Kuala Lumpur's International Airport, there are now giant promotional campaigns for the Belt and Road Initiative. So this would be taken as evidence showing that Malaysia is hedging towards the PRC. Yet, I find that this characterization may be incomplete and is a reductive sort of way of looking at an incredibly dynamic region. So my questions are, does hedging between the United States and the PRC sufficiently account for Southeast Asian behavior, and what are the limits to its explanations? Are we looking at such a dynamic region through a hegemonic lens that they are merely constantly reacting only towards the US and the PRC without consideration of other interests or other individual contexts? What confounding factors exist that affect Southeast Asian calculations? And what room is there for Southeast Asian agency? I hope and I was hoping to paint a more nuanced and complex picture of what drives Southeast Asian behavior beyond sort of the reductiveness of that hedging presents. So before we can go any further, I should probably explain what hedging is. Going into my literature review, hedging first needs to be, well, I guess I'll get to hedging, but first we have to understand three concepts: balancing, bandwagoning, and neorealism. These are sort of the core concepts that form the basis of hedging in international relations theory. Balancing is the concept that non-aligned states work with other non-aligned states to form a coalition against a rising power to achieve a balance of power. This was first coined by Stephen Walt in his book Alliance Formation, The Balance of World Power, arguing that smaller states that are sort of trapped in between rising great powers will band together in order to balance against both sides. Another theory to explain small state behavior, and this is within the context of the Cold War, when smaller states were caught between the United States and the Soviet Union, is bandwagoning. Bandwagoning suggests that states align with the rising power in order to benefit from its rise and secure themselves from being threatened. So instead of joining into a band of other small states to balance against the two powers, instead they will hedge their bets on one rising power to protect them. And this is expanded upon in Schweller's book, Bandwagoning for Profit. But both of these concepts, balancing and bandwagoning as explanations for small state behavior during the Cold War, are all based on neo-realist assumptions. Neorealism is sort of is a more modern school of thought within the broader school of realism in international relations theory, which basically holds that states are rational actors in an anarchic system, principally driven to secure their survival, and power in relation to other states is the primary means to achieve their survival. In a nutshell, meaning that states are primarily concerned with their survival, and power is the means through which that they can achieve their survival. And so that is achieved either against balancing against rising powers or to bandwagon with rising powers. And this is famously posited by Kenneth Waltz and John Mearsheimer. With Kenneth Waltz's defensive realism, which suggests that states, Kenneth Waltz's defensive realism more aligns with balancing, whereas with John Mearsheimer, power maximizing revisionism basically suggests that because states are interested in hegemony in order to achieve power, that they are to achieve power and survival, that they will not seek to balance against other states, and instead small states should bandwagon in order to account for that hegemonic behavior. So where does hedging lie in between all of these concepts? Well, balancing, bandwagoning, and neorealism, again, are all concepts that arose during the Cold War, largely derived from examples using Eastern European states. Yet, as more recent scholars have posited, it is problematic to project the Europe-derived story of international anarchy and balance of power politics as a permanent universal structural condition. As the Cold War ended and more scholars focused their attention on other regions of the world, they found that bandwagoning and balancing no longer could fully and accurately account for many states' behavior. This is also expanded upon by David Kang in 2003, mentioning that politics in other regions operate differently from the standard European model. This then resulted in the rise of the hedging theory, which is that hedging is a middle position between bandwagoning and balancing for cases that do not fit that dichotomy. This essentially means that states that hedge do a combination of bandwagoning and balancing in order to signal ambiguity to reduce risk. So instead of balancing and bandwagoning that more clearly delineate where a state's alliances are, hedging essentially keeps great powers guessing and unable to decide whether or not a state is signaling towards or against them. Hedging was first posited by Evelyn Goh in Meeting the China Challenge, the United States and Southeast Asian Regional Security Strategies, and was framed as a theory that could help explain Southeast Asian behavior that was often seen as not being able to fit within the dichotomy of bandwagoning and balancing. And Quick in 2016 expanded on the hedging theory, like introducing two different actions: returns maximizing actions that are then counteracted with risk contingencies in order to maximize benefits and reduce costs, and maintaining equal tension between great powers. Although hedging as a theory arose in order to account for Southeast Asian behavior, what the current literature sort of demonstrates is that there is widespread disagreement on how hedging works. As you can see here, these are several scholars that are listed, all who have tried to apply the hedging framework on Southeast Asia. And as you can see, and this is just within the period of 2013 to 2017, if you look at other periods, these answers change. But whether or not a state is hedging and in which direction towards the United States and the PRC, is not a universal, there is no universal agreement on what that answer is. And I argue that the flaw with hedging theory and being relied upon in order to fully explain Southeast Asian behavior is that ultimately, because hedging still relies on neorealist assumptions, it still falls into the same trap of applying Eurocentric lenses towards the region. And also, reduces the region and the states in the region to primarily prioritizing security and ignoring other factors that I'm hoping to explore, factors that can explain the discrepancies between why states are sometimes considered to be hedging towards the United States, towards the PRC, or neither, and at different points in time. As Quick mentions, structural uncertainties do not by themselves determine the extent and manner through which individual states choose to hedge, sort of acquiescing that there are still holes that hedging has yet to fill. However, that has not stopped hedging from being a popular concept adopted by policymakers around the world, and not less by those in the United States. In the Biden administration's most recent national security strategy, the concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific mentions that the strategy will ensure that nations are free to make their own choices with a particular focus on Southeast Asia, although not explicitly using the language of hedging, sort of acknowledging that Southeast Asian countries are sort of constantly having to choose between the US and the PRC, which is the binary that I find to be problematic. This is again expanded upon in Secretary of State Antony Blinken's speech that individual countries in the region, he's giving the speech in Jakarta, will be able to choose their own paths and their own partners. Again, suggesting a belief that Southeast Asian countries are sort of hedging their bets between the US and the PRC. Reports from prominent think tanks such as the RAND Corporation, which has very close ties to the Defense Department, also mention that Southeast Asian countries are very likely to remain in hedging mode to avoid antagonizing either side, demonstrating sort of the popularity of the hedging concept, even despite its flaws. So for my research design to sort of critically analyze hedging and its applications in Southeast Asia, I used 4 different methodologies. First, discourse and perception analysis, looking at sort of the way that Southeast Asian countries are talking about the situation themselves, whether through statements made by political leaders or also through prominent media published in the region. I also make use of historical analysis to better contextualize what other confounding factors might exist that are driving Southeast Asian behavior, as well as interviews and case studies. With my interviews, I interviewed 3 figures who have significant experience in the region. First, Scott Marcial, who is the former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific at the US State Department, and also the US Ambassador to Indonesia, and also assigned to the US Embassy in the Philippines. I also interviewed Dr. Shashi Jayakumar, the Singaporean representative to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, and also with RSIS, which is a prominent Singaporean defense think tank. And finally, I also interviewed a former senior Singaporean defense official. The reason why that I use case studies is to sort of, well, I utilize 2 case studies in order to investigate the limits of hedging. First, cases where Southeast Asian countries hedge in contrast to their security interests, and therefore diving deeper to understand what are the other confounding factors that are driving Southeast Asian countries to go against what hedging theory predicts that they should be doing. And second, cases where Southeast Asian countries are perceived to be hedging in alignment with what the theory predicts, but the decision making to make those decisions are actually driven by multifaceted interests that are not just relying upon security and survival. So first, my first case study is with AUKUS in Indonesia and Malaysia. So AUKUS stands for Australia, United Kingdom, and the United States, and it is a trilateral pact that was announced 2 years ago. As you can see, well, actually recently in 2023, they made another announcement, Biden, the Prime Minister of Australia, and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, basically agreeing, amongst other things, to share nuclear propulsion technology with Australia in order to develop submarines, military submarines that are driven by nuclear reactors. These go far beyond Australia's current defense capabilities. And as you can see by the timeline, by 2040, there's planned delivery of Australia's first nuclear submarines. And this deal was touted as sustaining a shared commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. Now, why? So, although AUKUS doesn't involve Indonesia and Malaysia, the deal has significant implications for both countries. Again, as I've mentioned before, the South China Sea is a highly disputed area, and it is widely predicted and suggested by official government documents related to AUKUS that these submarines are to be used to deter Chinese incursions in the South China Sea. Both Malaysia and Indonesia have had territorial disputes with PRC when it comes to the South China Sea, multiple sort of encounters with military boats in their claimed territorial waters. And as you can see in the graphic over there, that the AUKUS submarines must utilize Indonesian and Malaysian sea lanes in order to operate within the region. And with the nuclear propulsion technology, we'll be able to operate for longer periods of time than previously were able to and reach a farther range. Although this deal would therefore then be in the interest of Indonesia and Malaysia, considering that both countries have territorial disputes with the PRC and do not have the military capability themselves to defend their territorial interests, both Malaysia and Indonesia issued scathing remarks once AUKUS was announced, claiming that amongst other things, that the deal would increase tensions in the region, was a needless provocation, violation of international law, and in various op-eds, including by senior Indonesian officials, that this deal is created to start a war. So what are the confounding factors that might explain why Indonesia and Malaysia were not so keen for the announcement of AUKUS? Well, first, both countries have a historic distrust of external interference based on their histories. Both Malaysia and Indonesia were formerly colonized by European powers. Scott Marcial mentions that Dutch economic exploitation of Indonesia, especially that of natural resources, created a skepticism that continues till the modern day. And this shared history of colonization and external exploitation was a primary contributor to the formation of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in its founding document, the Bangkok Declaration, emphasizing the need to resist external interference by any powers, including by Western powers, including those that were involved in AUKUS. Well, with the historic distrust in external interference, ASEAN's key goal is to give Southeast Asian countries a voice, limit the role of big powers, and discourage their interference, and wants to take on a primary responsibility in regional affairs. This is evidenced in Indonesia's statement against AUKUS, highlighting that Australia must respect the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which is an ASEAN treaty that calls for freedom for external interference in return and calls for regional internal cooperation and peaceful coexistence, things that Indonesia considers to be violated by AUKUS. Other ASEAN agreements that Indonesia and Malaysia have also touted as being violated by AUKUS includes the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapons Free Zone, which is highlighted by Malaysia in their statement, which is highly based on commitments to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Indonesia and Malaysia are both party to. This also sort of manifested in Indonesia's sort of criticism of the NPT's submarine loophole that allows for nuclear propulsion technology to be shared amongst allies, amongst nuclear powers, even contravening the spirit of the agreement of trying to maintain a nuclear-free zone in Southeast Asia. Also, Malaysia highlighted violations of the zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality in the AUKUS agreement, which was born out of fears of external interference during the Cold War from communist insurgencies and militarization of the region from great powers during the Vietnam War and the United States' involvement. Another important factor in historic distrust of external interference comes from the non-aligned movement. Both Indonesia and Malaysia were highly involved in the non-aligned movement. Indonesia was a founding member of the non-aligned movement, and the non-aligned movement was founded in the Bandung Conference. The non-aligned movement being a coalition of considered small states during the Cold War that were neither aligned with the United States nor the Soviet Union. And the non-aligned mentality, as mentioned by Scott Marcial, still permeates through Indonesian and Malaysian policy decision-making today. The foreign minister of Malaysia in 2019 even emphasized wanting to bring back non-aligned principles into current modern Malaysian policymaking. And that sort of, can also play a contributing factor in condemning the external interference coming from AUKUS. There are also numerous historical examples of Western interference in Southeast Asia that are considered to be that has increased distrust amongst the Southeast Asian countries in relation to external interference. First, the CIA's widespread activities in the United States during the 1950s in support of several coups against Indonesia's First Leader Sukarno, but also an understated factor, as highlighted by Scott Marcial, which is that both Indonesia and Malaysia are majority Muslim countries that were turned away by perceived increased Islamophobia in the West post 9/11. These are other contributing factors. Next, my second case study looks at the Philippines, Singapore, and the South China Sea. So in this case, the Philippines and Singapore both face direct threats by the PRC's aggression in the South China Sea. The Philippines has its economic exclusive zone covering parts of the South China Sea that are also claimed by the PRC and have resulted in numerous confrontations over the years. While Singapore does not have official territorial disputes in the South China Sea, because Singapore's economy is so highly dependent on free trade that must traverse through the South China Sea, Singapore has a vested interest in maintaining open sea lanes and non-interference in the area. However, in contrast to Malaysia and Indonesia, the Philippines and Singapore both have close defense ties with the United States, which is what hedging theory would predict, since both countries do not have the military capability to resist PRC aggression. And this is evidenced by historic defense agreements between the United States, the Philippines, and Singapore. The Philippines is the United States' oldest ally in Southeast Asia, with the 1951 US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, meaning that the United States will come to the Philippines' aid if the Philippines is attacked. While Singapore is not an official treaty ally with the United States, it has signed strategic framework agreements and other historic agreements that have allowed for US ships and planes to operate from Singapore. And in recent years, as a result of the threats in the South China Sea, both the Philippines and Singapore have increased their defense cooperation with the United States, which is what hedging theory would predict in sort of hedging towards their security interests, and that the United States can provide security in a way against the sort of threat given by the United States, given by the PRC, as sort of evidenced by the 4 new enhanced defense cooperation agreement sites signed with the Philippines, and also the renewal of military agreements with the United States by Singapore. However, I argue that there are other factors at play that contribute to these decisions to have choice units that are not necessarily driven. So first, the Philippines is actually an outlier in Southeast Asia in terms of having a historic relationship with the United States. The Philippines was colonized by the United States from 1898 to 1946, but even post-1946 continued to host US military installations, including 2 of the US's largest naval and Air Force bases at the time, all the way until 1991. This is evidenced by the fact that when you look at sort of perceptions of the United States' reliability in the region, the Philippines consistently puts the United States higher than the ASEAN average, or any other country for that matter, with the exception of Vietnam in 2022. In public remarks given by the Philippines ambassador, mentioning that the United States and Philippines have a special relationship, being their oldest allies, and Scott Marcial acknowledging that what sets the Philippines apart from other Southeast Asian countries is the pro-US sentiment from being a former colony. However, this colonial relationship also has significant limits. This is evidenced as by the fact that there are constitutional restrictions preventing the basing of US military or any external foreign military in the Philippines as a result of that historic colonial relationship. And even with the announcement of recent agreements, such as the new military sites in the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement that are now allowing US troops to be restationed or to be able to have access access to these bases in the Philippines has resulted in outcry across the Philippines, including by the opposition leadership, mentioning that these are just moves to bring back a permanent US military presence in the region, and also questioning why these sites are sort of being positioned away from the direct territorial disputes that the Philippines faces in the South China Sea, to the west side as opposed to the north side. With Singapore, the interviews that I conducted with Singaporeans actually mentioned two key factors that are driving Singaporean behavior. First, pragmatism. Actually, the Singaporeans that I talked to actually resented the idea that Singapore is a neutral country. This is especially borne out by a historical context of Singapore being a small country with no resources, post-independence, surrounded by larger neighbors and armed conflict with larger neighbors, such as through confrontasi, when Indonesia was threatening Singapore and Malaysia's existence. This resulted in founding leaders in Singapore, such as Lee Kuan Yew, mentioning or highlighting the ideal of pragmatism and in order to survive, which drives Singaporean behavior in making choices based on what will support Singapore's survival given its precarious situation, including supporting the rules-based international order, since by being a tiny state, the rules-based international order will be able to protect the interests of small states as opposed to large states. And this is evidenced by, for example, the former president of Singapore acknowledging the importance of pragmatism in driving Singaporean foreign policy. Another factor that I did not consider is that the former Singaporean defense official mentioned that because of Singapore's unique placement at the crossroads of European colonialism, but also South Asian, East Asian cultural influences, that Singapore has a vested interest in international cooperation, that the world's problems are our problems, and that Singapore must necessarily consider international sort of context in making their decisions, which means that Singapore may often make decisions that are perceived to be hedging towards one way or another, but are actually reflections of pragmatism and a worldly outlook. Therefore, I find that hedging theory provides an incomplete picture of Southeast Asian behavior, and that Southeast Asian behavior cannot be reduced to simply making reactive choices between the United States and the PRC. That often Southeast Asian countries may take actions contrary to their security interests due to other historical and cultural factors, and that when Southeast Asian countries are perceived to be hedging towards what the theory would predict, that there are actually other factors that may be driving their behavior. This then paints a more nuanced and complicated picture of how the region operates, and also carries significant implications for how US policy should consider Southeast Asian perspectives and view the region through a non-hegemonic lens. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. If you want to have a seat up here.
Okay.
So we'll go to Q&A, and as per tradition, we'll start with advisors. So Dr. Vardy, do you have any questions or comments?
Thank you very much. So, Sean, we had many conversations about it. All were wonderful. But I'm going to ask the unfair question, which is, given that the theory is lacking and it cannot predict behavior as we were hoping it to be, there's no recipe, so it seems, right? What are your policy recommendations, right? In this case, no recipe, what would you advise?
Well, I think
easy one.
I think more qualified people than me have tried to answer that question, right? I think, as any good research probably does, my research sort of presents more questions than answers in terms of how the United States should approach Southeast Asia. I think my main takeaway, as actually emphasized by Ambassador Romualdez's remarks in Washington, D.C., is that if the US is interested in pursuing policies that, for example, might be better received by countries, as evidenced by AUKUS, it must consider sort of all of these factors that I've outlined, and I think primarily listen to Southeast Asians and emphasize their agency, because currently the hegemonic lens that is being applied through hedging theory sort of reduces Southeast Asian countries to, as my title suggests, pawns on a chessboard.
Any other questions? We have time for one quick one. Yeah, we'll go to Ethan Lee. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Other advisor, Dr. Cohen.
I'm following up on what you just said about agency. Following up on what you just said about agency, Something that I was expecting you to mention is a central ASEAN doctrine called ASEAN centrality. Um, how does ASEAN centrality relate to the agency issue and counter hegemony, as you were discussing?
Right. I wish I had more time to expand on that. I actually did mention, maybe it wasn't big enough in text, ASEAN centrality on my slides. But I think ASEAN centrality is one of the sort of confounding factors that I've highlighted, considering the history of ASEAN being born as a multilateral organization among Southeast Asian countries in order to take primary responsibility for the region's affairs, in contrast to external interference. And that is a huge contributing factor to why Indonesia and Malaysia resisted AUKUS and found it to be circumventing external powers, circumventing the centrality of this regional framework built on consensus amongst all of the regions, amongst the region's 10 countries. And so I think the United States, as a result of the negative reaction that came from AUKUS, needs to consider ASEAN centrality and increase cooperation with ASEAN, considering that Southeast Asian countries have a preference for relying on ASEAN when managing the region's affairs.
Great. Let's thank Sean one more time. And we'll move now to our second talk, Maryam Khalil.
I mean, yeah, so I can see your faces. Hi. Hello, thank you. I'm good, I'm nervous.
How do you feel?
Nervous, but we're good. Yes. I know, I'm like, please, I can see your faces. Yeah, it's good. I know. It's good, yay. I'm excited. Okay, it'll be good. Okay. Do I go this far? Okay. Is everyone settled? I don't want to keep anyone out from the hallway. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Maryam Khalil. I'm going to be presenting about refoulement, migration in the Libyan health system. I want to give special thanks to Dr. Tracy, Dr. Trincunas, my advisors, Dr. Salam, Professor Blades, and Professor Cruz, and to my CSAC cohort. So my interest in this topic stemmed from my experiences working at Abu Slim Accident and Trauma Hospital in Libya in the summer of 2022. Yeah, and this is really an interesting case because the Abu Slim Accident and Trauma Hospital is a free and public hospital in Libya, and it's very resource poor, and it helps a lot of migrants and displaced people. So we saw a lot of interesting cases. And I wanted to contextualize this presentation with the very real experiences of migrants who try to access healthcare in Libya and often fail. So Abdul is a 16-year-old Sudanese migrant, and he says, I was in pain and bleeding. I collected money and went to a hospital. I was desperate to stop the pain. Once at the gate, no one wanted to rescue me. I was told that there was no doctor to take care of me. I was simply asked to leave. So a roadmap of this presentation, I'll quickly go over a background of Libya. I'm going to make the case for de facto refoulement. Then I'm going to talk about my survey results, and we'll get into discussions and questions. And I'm going to run through a lot of this because there's a lot of content, so please ask me questions about it later. First, into Libya. So the Gaddafi regime from 1969 to 2011, if you know anything about Gaddafi, you know he's like a quasi-socialist. So one of the first things he did when he came to power was establish Public Health Code number 106, which made public care, like healthcare in Libya, free and available to all. And this very much remains the same in Libya today. Most of healthcare is free for the public. Next, we have the first civil war, which many of you probably heard about. It started in 2011, and it ousted Gaddafi as dictator. And this is a photo of a hospital, a makeshift hospital in Misrata, Libya in 2011. And Gaddafi regime bombed medical facilities. They denied patients treatment. They abducted doctors and forced doctors to work only on pro-regime soldiers. Next is the Second Civil War, and this is an image of a fire on Al Khadr General Hospital, which was one of the biggest hospitals in Tripoli, and it was bombed by a barrage of rockets, and there were 300 patients being treated there, and there was also like medicine and supplies that was being stored there, right? So we can really see kind of what the Libyan health system looks like. And then we'll get into the migrant crisis. And I have migrant crisis in quotations because I find it quite Eurocentric that only when Europe became overwhelmed by migrants did we start calling it a crisis, right? So there's an estimated 700,000 to 1 million migrants in Libya, and about a sixth of them, that's about a sixth of the Libyan population. And I think this thesis is focused on migrants outside of detention centers, is encapsulated by this quote from Jafar Hussein, who is the head of mission in Libya for the World Health Organization. And he says, many end up in prisons or detention centers, but there are hundreds of thousands who are outside the detention centers. They are completely dependent on the public sector and to a lesser extent on the private sector if they can afford it. So now we'll get into refoulement. Can someone read that out for me, especially if you speak French? Maryam, I'm gonna make you do it. Okay.
Refoulement, forced return is when a state adopts measures at its border that prohibit and actively prevent a foreign person who is not already a legal resident of its territory from entering its national territory. Médecins sans frontières.
Yeah. So refoulement is illegal under the 1951 Geneva Convention and its 1967 protocol, which Libya is not a party to either of those, but all European nations are. So keep that in mind when we talk about that later. And an example of actual refoulement actually happened over a month ago, where the Greek Coast Guard, there were 12 migrants who arrived on the island of Lesbos, and the Greek Coast Guard took them in an unmarked van, took them to the middle of the Aegean Sea, put them on a raft, and left them to be. That is what actual refoulement is. So who are the key actors in monitoring the central Mediterranean? Other than like the Mediterranean European coastal guards, there's also Frontex, which is the European Union's like larger border control and Coast Guard agency. And then what I'll be focusing on a lot is the Libyan Coast Guard, or I'll refer to it as the LCG sometimes. So my research objectives, the first one, which we're going to get into right now, is whether European Union bodies, including Frontex, are partaking in de facto refoulement through the Libyan Coast Guard as a proxy force. And I'm going to argue that the Libyan Coast Guard functions as an arm of Frontex in the European Union. And I'm going to say this because they get their money from the European Union, they get their patrol boats from the European Union, they get their technology, their surveillance technology from Frontex, which is an extension of the European Union, and then they are literally trained by Frontex, right? And I'm going to make a case for de facto refoulement, or in practice refoulement, right? I'm going to do that by establishing that the Libyan Coast Guard is an illegitimate body. I'm going to use NGO reports, drone flight patterns, and WhatsApp messages to show that the EU's involvement. And I'm going to look at trends in arrivals to Europe. So one, the Libyan Coast Guard has been accused of smuggling, human trafficking, and violence. And I think this is best encapsulated by this example of Abdurrahman al-Milad. He is one of the heads of the Coast Guard. He's wanted by Interpol, and in his indictment by the United Nations Security Council, they said there were several witnesses in criminal investigations that stated they were picked up at sea by armed men on a Coast Guard ship that al-Milad was commander of, and taken to Al Nasab Detention Center, which is a detention center in Libya that is not managed by the government. It is managed by a militia group. And they reportedly held them in brutal conditions and subject to beatings. Next are some NGO reports. I'm not going to get too much into this, but feel free to ask me questions. But Sea-Watch is one of the most known NGOs that works to rescue people in the Mediterranean. And they filed a lawsuit against Frontex before the General Court of the European Union because they said that Frontex violated international maritime and human rights law through their use of the Libyan Coast Guard as a proxy. So next are drones. Frontex has two main aerial assets. They have IAI Heroine and the Hermes 900. And something really interesting is if you map out like Frontex's aerial asset hours of flight to the number of interceptions by the Libyan Coast Guard, you see a very distinct correlation. So as the number of aerial asset hours of flight of Frontex drones increases, the number of interceptions by the Libyan Coast Guard also increase. So you see this like fundamental relationship between the two. Next is WhatsApp messages. So Frontex is like, oh, we've never engaged in any direct cooperation with the Libyan authorities. And then Q, WhatsApp messages between Frontex and the Libyan Coast Guard. And this is from Fragdenstadt, which is a German NGO, and they got these WhatsApp messages about Frontex and Libyan Coast Guard communicating about migrant interceptions through a Freedom of Information Act request. So next are arrivals to Europe. So Libyan Coast Guard and Frontex kind of established a relationship in 2015, 2016, and you can see arrivals to Europe went down after that relationship was established. So I say de facto refoulement, I say refoulement. Is it kind of both? So there is evidence and reports of European bodies engaging in refoulement. However, the EU is also circumventing refoulement by using the Libyan Coast Guard, and that's the bulk of my argument. So my second research objective was to look at whether the state of the Libyan health system and the European Union's refoulement stance were linked. And my predictive hypothesis was that de facto refoulement would create an influx of migrants that would cause patient overcrowding in Libyan health facilities, and that would lead to health system burden and a lack of sufficient healthcare. So to do this, I deployed a survey in Libya in English and Arabic using Kobo Toolbox, which is a platform used by the UN largely because it has online and offline capabilities. And I worked with a number of NGOs, mainly International Medical Corps, Abu Slim Hospital, and organizations and physicians across the country. And I wanted to really assess how migrants access the healthcare system, how health workers perceived providing care to migrants, and how NGO workers interacted with the medical apparatus and migrants. I had 50 respondents to my survey, and the cross overlap you see is that some people identified as more than one thing. So we actually had 2 migrants who were health workers, for instance. And my migrants were from Nigeria, Liberia, Sudan, and Chad, and there were 7 of them. None of them reported coming to Libya for health reasons. 3 of them were employed and 4 were unemployed. And I thought the best way of looking at migrant data was kind of case studies. So I'll begin with the case study of Fatima, and these are all pseudonym names. She's a migrant from Chad who's been in Libya for just over a year, and she reports attempting to migrate across the Mediterranean 3 times. And she's one of the only people who responded to this question. Most of my migrants left it blank because at the time of deployment of this survey, there were mass arrests of migrants and NGO workers in Libya. So people were really scared to take it, and which you should ask me about because it's really interesting the stories that people made up. But for health access, that she reports accessing healthcare facilities, specifically an accident and emergency hospital, when her time of delivery was near. And she says that legal documentation affected her health access, and she reports receiving the healthcare she needed. And she's the only migrant who said that the health system improved. And she says she accessed the specific facility because of its free services. So it showcases the cycles that migrants stick stuck in, attempting to leave Libya, but also being unable to do so. And it also showcases the need for free services for migrants. Next is Blessing, who's a migrant from Nigeria who volunteers at an NGO. She's been in Libya for over 5 years, and she does not respond to the question about migration across the Mediterranean. She reports attempting to access OBGYN services at a public healthcare center. She reports that legal documentation affected her health access, and she was the only migrant to report that she did not receive the healthcare that she needed, and she attributes that to a lack of documentation. And she said she went to this specific facility because of its proximity to her home, and she reports a deterioration of Libya's health system. And it shows, again, that we need clear avenues for documentation for migrants in Libya, and it showcases the proper avenues of documentation, the lack of documentation affects people's health access. And I think looking at John and Blessing in contrast is really interesting because John is a migrant from Liberia who works in a compensated manner, right? At an NGO. He's been in Libya for over 5 years, and he doesn't respond to the question about migration. He says he went to a private hospital or clinic in Libya, and he reports that legal documentation affected his health access. And so that's why he went to this specific private facility, because they don't ask for paperwork. So there's like a thing where migrants who have money can circumvent needing documentation by having money. But in Blessing's case, she's unemployed, doesn't have the ability to pay for services, right? So her lack of documentation affects her much more than John. Next, we'll get into the NGO workers. I had 14 respondents. All of them said they worked to help migrants access healthcare. And they worked at a range of jobs like referral and outreach, helped with gynecology and general health, and also like worked in remote and city areas. So 57% of the cohort reported having referral mechanisms in place. And of those people, they still said there are no communication services between hospitals, health centers, international organizations, speaking to how the infrastructure in Libya is not suited for migrants to clearly access the things that they need to access, especially in regards to health. And 71% of the NGO cohort report not having programmatic mechanisms. And one NGO worker says there are tons of barriers migrants face while trying to access healthcare services in Libya, of which documentation is one, lack of understanding in the types of services given in primary health care facilities and hospitals, and a mix and confusion between public services, private services, and UN NGO services. So 50% of the NGO cohort reported an increase in migrants and a deterioration of the health system, and 100% of the cohort reported an increase in migrants seeking to access the healthcare system. I didn't have enough data to show statistical significance. And when asked specifically, have you observed a change in the number of migrants who are returned to Libya by the Libyan Coast Guard? 11 out of 14 of them said yes. So next is the health worker data. I had 36 health workers, and most of them were doctors. They worked at a variety of types of health facilities. And this is probably the thing I'm most proud of in this project. I somehow got people from all 3 regions of Libya. So Libya is historically divided into Tripolitania, Fezzan in the east, and Syrianka in the south. And I got my health workers to respond from all those regions. And there's different kinds of migrants going to different regions, right? So this is really important. Yeah. So baseline issues affecting health workers in Libya, the biggest one is lack of payment. When I was working in Abu Slim, one of the chiefs of surgery reported that he had not gotten paid for 6 months. And he still continued to come because the health facility would not function without him providing that care, right? So 70% of them said that the health system deteriorated. 60% reported a change in the number of migrants. And again, I did not have enough to have statistical data, statistical significance, but most of them said a deterioration was correlated with an influx of migrants. And so for some qualitative data, I found it really some themes like patient overcrowding, need for population-specific services. I think the thing, you have the things you would expect, oh, there's a bad impact. It takes the facility from Libyan people. It makes people more depressed. It's crowded. But the thing I was most shocked by and gives me some optimism is that a lot of people said it allowed us that we needed to see more services for them, like TB services, RH disease services. We needed translation services. Other people saw it as an educational opportunity. Migrants provide health workers an ability to see new and different cases. And then also people said, oh, we were able to treat pregnant women and save their lives through the facilitation of safe deliveries. So it wasn't all bad. And then when asked how and to what effect their demographics evolved, a lot of them spoke about migrants and displaced people. And specifically, this person said through an increase in the number of displaced and migrant people, it leads to overcrowding tertiary centers and private clinics. I left them how they did. Some of these people, English is clearly not their first language, although it was available in English and Arabic. So that's why there's some misspellings. So my conclusions are that the European Union partakes in de facto refoulement by externalizing their border to Libya through the use of the Libyan Coast Guard as a proxy force. 2, there was an influx in migrants in Libya's health facilities in part due to this externalization. 3, migrants face a plethora of difficulties accessing the healthcare system, like documentation, which we talked about, income, and discrimination. And then health workers report an overburdened health system. You can see that through patient overcrowding, a lack of pay, and a lack of supplies. And then NGO data from my survey, as well as external reports, indicate that there are not appropriate programmatic or referral mechanisms to help migrants access health or understand Libya's complex health system. And the Libyan Coast Guard is returning migrants to Libya in larger numbers than before. That was corroborated also by my NGO data, as well as external reports. So the refugee regime, when I say this, the people who are making the laws about migrants and refugees, like the EU, international bodies of law, Frontex, Libya, they're all complicit in migrants' lack of adequate and accessible healthcare because they know that the UNHCR is chronically overwhelmed in Libya. They know that there are no clear-cut avenues for migrants to seek asylum or refugee status. And they know that the Libyan Coast Guard continues to commit human rights violations, and they continue to work with them. And they also know of Libya's dire health infrastructure, and they allow migrants to be sent back there. Clearly, those migrants will be accessing that dire healthcare infrastructure. As for policy relevance, I think Libya should ratify the 1951 Geneva Convention and its 1967 protocol. Libya has been like a bunch of interim governments, so I don't know if I hold it as much accountable as I do the EU, but it should do that. Libya should also end the criminalization of migration. That's still criminalized from the Gaddafi regime days. Libya should establish clear laws for asylum seekers and refugees. There's just no laws. It's just like illegal migration, regardless of if you're a refugee or not. And the EU should end relations with Libyan Coast Guard because they know that Libya has proven to be a violent and unsafe place for migrants. And this is similar to the Hersey decision of 2012. Ask me questions about that. And then EU should support the establishment of clear ways for migrants to access legal pathways for migration because, as I said, the UN is overwhelmed in Libya. And then the EU should be held accountable for their use of the Libyan Coast Guard as a proxy force. Lastly, the Libyan Coast Guard and the EU should be held accountable for the thousands of migrant deaths on their hands, and both in the sea and in detention centers across the country. And international bodies should support Libya in rebuilding its post-war health infrastructure, especially with its status as the gateway from the global south to the global north. This is something I didn't know, but Libya is where most migrants go from the global south to Europe. So this includes Bangladesh, Pakistan, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. They all mostly go through Libya. And this thesis didn't focus on migrants who are incarcerated in Libya, but I really did want to touch on it. And a book that I think everyone should read is My Fourth Time We Drowned, Seeking Refuge on the World's Deadliest Migration Route. It's by Sally Hayden, and she says, I stumbled on a human rights disaster of epic proportions. So the reason she wrote this book is because a migrant in a detention center in Libya somehow found a phone and messaged her about the situation. And then that culminated in a 4-year project where she tried to get the stories of these migrants. And from a migrant's own voice, earlier this year, the UN made an independent fact-finding mission in Libya on these detention centers. And one migrant says, our concern is not dying in the water. Our concern is to go back to the prison where we will be oppressed and tortured by guards. I also wanted to give a shout out to Nabila, who now works at the World Health Organization, but she is my contact for like how I got into the NGO space in Libya. And questions. Thank you all.
Maryam, if you'd like to have a seat at the front.
Can I sit here because I have some slides?
Yeah, you can stand.
Okay, stand.
And then we'll go to Maryam's advisors, Dr. Blades and Dr. Salam, for first comments and questions.
Thank you so much for an amazing presentation. I wanted to know if race, religion, or national origin play a role in access to health facilities in Libya.
Definitely. I think it's really interesting because it's based off of, I think largely, like, even if you're like, if the person speaks Arabic, you'll know where they're from through their accent. So there's a lot of discrimination based off of that. And there definitely is a lot of discrimination based off of race. Less so on religion. I think actually it's not as evident. I would say that race is probably the most thing. Something else that I found interesting is like when you go to outside of health centers, but like extortion, it's also based off of race. They'll see who comes from where, and if that country is perceived as wealthier, then those people are more likely to be extorted. So Bangladeshis are more likely to be extorted than people from Nigeria. So, yeah. Oh yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Maryam. What a journey this has been.
Yeah.
I think I have a comment and a question. I mean, my first comment is the fact I want to congratulate you on a great project. I know everything is presented here in kind of like very neat, very fancy PowerPoint slides, and it looks like everything fell into place magically. But honestly, like the process of research was much more iterative, to state it kind of diplomatically, but there is certainly a lot of turbulence.
Yeah.
Things didn't work out as planned, but what was really impressive about this is the extent to which you've adapted. You've, when surveys didn't work, you found other ways. You've exercised a lot of creativity and innovation to make things work, and I commend you for this. I have a question for you.
Mhm.
So, touching upon the question, so what you're suggesting here in this project is the extent to which Libyan political leadership is in effect acting as the police of the EU and various relevant authorities in the EU's coast guards, in the Southern Europe's countries' coast guards authorities. And what I'd like to hear a little bit more about is, I mean, you've mentioned the issue of funding for these bureaucracies in Libya, but what I'd like to hear more about, what is the political leadership getting out of this? The Libyan political leadership getting out of this, while keeping into consideration, of course, the question of leadership is kind of a little bit, I mean, to say the least, was a little bit of a moving target across the period that you're studying here.
No, I think that's a great question. I'll start with the fact that we didn't hear about this issue before because Gaddafi would use it as like a weapon where he's like, oh, if you guys are doing what I want you to do, then I'll like keep the migrants in. If the EU is not doing, if you guys aren't doing what I want or not letting me do what I want, then I'll like kind of let the like borders go, right? And I think in similar vein, like right now the government is very destabilized and they need some sort of funding. They also want to be on Europe's good side because of the tensions that are going on, and like people are like, oh, if the European Union's backed us, our government will stay. And there's like 3 people who are saying that their government, like they have the government in Libya. And I think that is largely, it's kind of the same thing again, where they want the European support and therefore they'll do what Europe says in that sense, so that they'll have that support to maintain power in Libya. I don't know if that's a good question. Remind me of the CC video too.
Can you wait for the mic, please?
Oh, sorry.
Because we
There's
have
like
people
Zoom
online.
people.
And please start with your name.
Hi, Maryam. It's lovely. My name is Richard McGrail. I'm just wondering if you happen to know, and I apologize if not, this is a little bit outside the scope of your presentation. Would it be possible for a non-EU national to file some kind of legal claim in an EU court or even in the courts of, let's say, Germany or whatever the largest player is who's providing funding for the Libyan Coast Guard and or Frontex?
I think
So,
that
or just, so either like a person who has been harmed, a migrant, like for example, the first slide, the Sudanese person, young man who was harmed, could that person file suit given, and could research like yours be used as evidence in a particular kind of juridical claim against either the EU as a whole or individual nation states within the EU?
Yeah, that's a great question. That goes back to the Hersey decision that I said of 2012. Hersey Jama is there was a boat of Somali and Eritrean migrants who then filed a lawsuit against Italy because what Italy did was they were supposed to like take them in, but they sent them back to Libya. They said that you sending us back to Libya is against international human rights law. So that has happened again before, and happened in 2012. And I argue more of that should be happening. I guess my research could be used. Sure. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that people who are not EU nationals do have the ability to file lawsuits against EU bodies.
Go to this side of the room, and then you next.
Thanks, Maryam, for the presentation. I had one question. Do you have any insight on who's facilitating migration on the Libyan borders from the coast?
Like on the borders or on the coast?
Who is taking the migrants through Europe? Because I know in Tunisia, for example, it's a big issue. Those people tend to be like commercialized and take advantage of migrants. There's like a big issue there, and I was wondering if you have any perspective.
Oh yes. Smuggling groups are largely linked to the militias. So I'm gonna like generally say that militia groups, non-state actors in Libya, are largely facilitating the smuggling. Yeah.
Got another question right here.
Hi, Maryam. Congratulations on an amazing presentation. I think it's really inspiring to see someone shed light on an important topic in North Africa. My question has to do with earlier you mentioned that some of your participants were hesitant to answer some questions or even engage with the survey altogether. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah. Okay. This is really funny. So I get a call one day from one of the physicians at Muslim Trauma Hospital, and she's like, "Oh, people don't want to fill out your survey because they think you work for the CIA," which is really funny. So I was like, "What?" But I think it's honestly understandable. The Libyan people have been kind of largely like a lot of what their situation right now is due to like Western powers, right? And I completely understand that rhetoric. It's just very funny because I'm like pretty anti-establishment. So it was really interesting. Yeah. And then a lot of migrants rightfully did not want to, because there are like still mass arrests going on, as well as NGO workers. None of the NGO workers wanted to identify the NGO they worked for, except for Nabila, because I worked directly with her. So I didn't like want to pressure people. And I created the survey after talking to a lot of people who worked in Libya to understand this position and to make sure that my survey didn't like ask questions. And the questions that I thought were too sensitive, I allowed them not to respond to. Yeah, thank you.
One more question.
Hi.
Hi.
Congrats.
Thank you.
So amazing. Yeah, proud of you. My question is around, like you talked about accountability and talked about holding the Libyan government accountable and also the EU. And I know for like a lot of folks in these situations, like lawsuits, legal routes, those types of routes are inaccessible. So I think my question is around what other like mechanisms are available to people, and like what's like another view of like what accountability could look like, or holding these like on a global scale, like
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I guess I'll ask you guys, how many of you knew about this before I talked about it? And I think that like right there is the answer, right? We need to make sure that people know and are aware of this, especially people who are citizens of countries that have a lot more power in this world, right? In Libya, even like, that's why I usually argue that the people who are EU nationals should do it. A lot of like human rights activists, lawyers, stuff like that, who try to do things against the government get abducted, get murdered, all this stuff, right? So it's much easier to do this, I personally think, through the EU, but I also think that if you have the privilege, you should be talking about this. And I think that's just the best way to do it outside of like a legal like lawsuit, right? So yeah.
All right, let's thank Maryam one more time.
Oh, and also congrats to everyone, because we're done now with this CSAC cohort. So yeah.